von Reichtum, Macht und Kontrolle, schreibt darüber verständlich und klar, um schließlich Positionen für die Benachteiligten, Unterlegenen und Opfer von Ungerechtigkeiten einzunehmen. Zitat Ende. Frau George, Sie haben das Wort.
Dankeschön. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. And I'm afraid that's all the German there will be. It's a great honor to be at this 10th anniversary Friedenskonferenz, and particularly because, as you were reminded, I was asked to the first one, so I must have said something worthwhile, and I hope that tonight I will be able to do the same because they've asked me back, so that's a challenge, but a very great honor, and I'm delighted to be here. Let me tell you why I am here first, which really is my conclusion. I wanted very much to come, and I said yes immediately when I received the invitation, because I feel very deeply that we are now in the most dangerous period of human history. This may sound exaggerated, but this is really my sense. And unless all forces against these dangers are united, we may very well lose. And that's why I'm here, because I'm going to ask every one of you to respond to this crisis in a particular way, which I will try to tell you at the end. Why is this the most dangerous period in human history? Most of you, perhaps if you're my age, you joined the peace movement with the Cold War. And that was a very scary period. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was terrifying, and the nuclear race was terrifying. And everyone who joined the peace movement then was absolutely right to do so. So you may feel that I'm a little bit crazy if I say that maybe the Cold War was not as bad as what we have today. Why? Because in geopolitical terms, there was no place on Earth which was unimportant during the Cold War. Because every place in Africa or Asia or Latin America, I don't care where, could become a base for the Soviet Union or for the United States. It could become a center of gravity, a means of influence for one power or the other, but the other power could not afford to neglect those places either. And that was why we had so much importance placed on development aid, on keeping everyone in one great big global family and helping everyone to emerge from poverty. It was against this Cold War background that happened. And it was because of this two-power rivalry that we lived in this kind of configuration. Well, for the last 20 years, it has become clearer and clearer every day that we are in a completely different geopolitical situation today. Today, I'm sorry to say, there are plenty of places on Earth which are totally unimportant. They don't count strategically, and the people in them don't count very much. This is the scary part too, because capitalism has won. Once the wall was down in Berlin, capitalism spread across the earth with breathtaking speed, and now there are only a few islands, and not very happy ones either, like North Korea, that say blatantly, we are not capitalist. But globalization, capitalist, neoliberal globalization has also won. And I never use the word globalization by itself. It has to have an adjective with it. I usually say neoliberal globalization, because if you just say globalization, it sounds as though it means that we are all together, happy and hand in hand, and going towards the promised land all together. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because globalization is a machine to exclude. It is a machine to exclude regions, to exclude states, and above all, to exclude people. And I do not want you to think I am cynical, because this is part of my fear and of my concern. But let me tell you that just looking coldly at where we are now, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who do not count, who are superfluous, who have no interest for capitalism because they don't produce anything that the world economy wants, and they don't consume enough to count. And in this kind of a situation, we have now reached crisis point. We have reached the point where a very few people, whom I call the Davos class, they are the people who met last week in Davos. I'm not saying individually that they are horrible people. I don't know them. Maybe morally they're very kind and pleasant. But as a class, they are always going to defend certain interests. And these millions, these hundreds of millions of people who are superfluous, they don't care. Those people and those interests and their system takes the best and leaves the rest. So, our period, because of the crises, which are all converging, and I'm going to say something very brief about each one of them, we are in a period which is even more frightening than the Cold War, in my view. First, we've had, as you all know as well as I do, the financial crisis, which is in reducing living standards everywhere, where people who had absolutely nothing to do with producing this financial crisis are being made to pay for it, in Germany as well as the rest of Europe, but also in other parts of the world. I call it a moral crisis as well, when the innocent are punished and the guilty are rewarded, as our financial wizards and geniuses have all been rewarded for plunging us into the worst financial mess since the 1930s. But it isn't just that this has happened and that 200 million people are unemployed in the world, as the International Labour Organization tells us. It is also that this contributes to violence and to instability and to conflict. You know that when all the money started to go rotten on the subprime market, billions were pulled out of those products and they were put into commodity speculation on wheat, corn, rice, soya, and other food commodities. And the result was the doubling, sometimes the tripling, of the prices of those basic foodstuffs. And when you're already paying 70 or 80% of the very little income that you have, and you're paying for food with that meager income, then when the prices double or triple, you have no recourse. So what happened in 2008? There were food riots in 30 to 35 countries. And those riots took place for the first time in history, because famine usually strikes the countryside and famine is usually a highly localized phenomenon, but this wasn't. This was first of all on the peripheries of cities, peopled very often by ex-peasants, and it happened all over the place simultaneously because of the price of food, which was a result of financial speculation in New York, Chicago, and London, which had nothing to do with those people and cared nothing about them. So when the price of wheat goes up, by 31% in a single day in March of 2008, you know you are not in a normal period. And in 2011, the prices are a little bit higher than they were in 2008. Second very, very big crisis, inequality, which brings out the worst in people. The more there is a tiny sliver, a tiny fringe of people at the top who are making millions, and the people at the bottom are feeling looked down upon, they are feeling neglected. Income and inequality, it's not so much a question of who has what, so long as you don't feel that you are really being left behind. If you have, if most people have, maybe somebody has 10 times as much as you do, but if you don't feel you're being left out of your society, you can live with that. But what we have now, people are not living with it. And it brings out the worst. And statistically, and I could give you many, many examples, but statistically, what we know about inequality is that the most unequal societies have more delinquency, more criminality, higher prison populations, more homicides, etc., etc. We are also, of course, in the worst climate crisis, and here my fear is multiplied. The worst climate crisis that mankind has ever known. It is particularly worrisome because we are now 7 billion people in the world, and it is probably, of all these crises, the greatest threat to peace and stability. I am not the only person, obviously, who knows this, because the official conference is discussing this issue. It came to the agenda in 2008 when Javier Solana, who was then the equivalent of the foreign minister of Europe, put it on the agenda by talking about climate and security and speaking of climate as a threat multiplier. He also uses the words a threat amplifier or a threat accelerator, but in any case, what climate does, climate change creates complications for European interests. The Pentagon then, in its triennial defense review, also elaborates on the subject of climate change. But what is very interesting, if you like, is that nobody wants actually to say that they are going to have to use authoritarian measures to deal with the consequences of climate change. And they aren't even trying now to contain climate change. They are only dealing with those consequences. But they're not dealing with those consequences in an open way. It's not being discussed. It's not, maybe it's on the table at this official conference, but I think it's probably going on behind closed doors, because what is happening is that we know that there will be innumerable migrants, people who will be forced out of the places they live now because they simply cannot exist there anymore. We know that there will be resource wars. The Arctic is being denuded of ice. The passage is now, the Arctic Passage is now open 3-4 months of the year. Huge resources of petroleum are being uncovered. Russia has already planted its flag. Canada and the United States will have an interest, and so will Europe, in that area. What's going to happen? We don't know. We don't know what the European Frontex agency intends for the migrants. What are they going to do? Line up the troops at the border and machine gun these migrants who try to get into Europe? And there will be a great many of them. We have food wars already, because 2008 taught governments that if they couldn't be self-sufficient in food, they should go somewhere else and grab somebody else's land and produce on that. And this time it's not just the West, it's also Saudi Arabia, it's the Gulf states, it is China to some degree. Lots of others are getting into this game, but that means that millions in Africa in particular, but not only, are being dispossessed. We have water wars, we have companies trying to get control over the water supply. All of these things are creating new instabilities and new reasons for conflict. We will have extreme weather events. We already know that. They are already happening. The consequences of those, of course, are going to hit poor people. They're going to hit women harder. They're going to hit well, it will be a class phenomenon, as we've already seen in Pakistan, Bangladesh, when Russia was burning last summer, etc. And how are our states going to respond? Well, from what I hear, they are developing their response, but they're not telling us about it. And most of that response, because people they know are not going to suffer quietly forever, and people will protest. And how are they going to meet these protests? Well, with what they call non-lethal weapons. Sounds very nice, they don't kill you. Non-lethal weapons are weapons designed not to kill you, but from a great distance, even from a satellite sometimes, they can blind you, they can make you deaf, they can make you vomit for hours. There are a lot of extremely nasty, extremely unpleasant weapon systems under development, which are going to be used as part of the state violence arsenal, but they will be used not just against foreigners. They will also be used against anyone who dares to protest. So, the reason I'm here, and what I really want to say to you with as much force as I can tonight, is that unfortunately, the many movements, the alter globalization movement, the ecological movement, the trade unions, don't necessarily know the peace movement people. This is my case. I travel quite a lot. Once I went to The Hague for a big peace conference. There were hundreds of organizations there. They had their publications, they had their tables out, they had their activities, and I thought, I know about 3 of these organizations. We haven't got together enough. We have not yet started to work together. So I am here because I fear for the future of all of us, because the Davos class doesn't really worry that much about climate change and resource wars. They know that they can probably survive because they can have gated communities, they can have their own, they can move to Swedish islands if they need to. They don't have to go to Saint-Tropez or Ibiza in the summer. They can have private armies if they need them. They'll be okay. And we can see from Copenhagen, from Cancun, and just recently from Durban, that they don't really intend to do much about this. The oil interests are too strong, the vehicle interests are too strong, and they're not going to hit out to do anything serious about the carbon economy. So to sum up, I want to point out that we were really at the center of several converging crises. All of them threaten peace and all of them threaten human security. The climate crisis is going to displace innumerable people and it will have other impacts that we haven't even thought of yet. The financial crisis has created innumerable unemployed people. Young people feel that they haven't got much of a future. They are giving more and more reasons to populations everywhere to say, well, they don't care about me, why should I care about anything? I am just going to go ahead and get what I can while I can. Notions of human solidarity are being degraded by this crisis and by the inequality crisis as well. I think many of our societies in Europe, but you can start with Greece, which could erupt at any time, they feel that there's no hope for themselves, for their families, for their countries, for their future. And in this context, people can and will decide that they're not going to sit there and take it anymore. And they will react. And the state, I fear, will meet them with increasing violence. And that is why, although it may seem that our goals are different, I happen to be honorary president of attac-France. That's been my main social movement concern, but I used to be on the International Board of Greenpeace. I'm very concerned about the environment. But all of our movements, let's say you have peace and conflict issues are your main circle of concerns, and that's fine because we need you desperately. And maybe mine are neighboring, but they're more like that. But in all of our circles of concern, we can find those two arcs that show that we have a common ground that we can and must build on together. We have to identify those issues, and the way to do that is to come and talk to each other, the way I'm trying to do this evening. Identify those concerns, figure out how we can build on them together, because we don't really represent different interests. We represent the great mass of the people. We have the numbers, we have the ideas, we know what needs to be done, we even know how to do it, and collectively we even have the money, collectively. So what I am saying is that our goals are all part of the same vision for a better world, and I hope that tomorrow and all the tomorrows that follow, you will want to go out and reach out to the Greens, to the women's organizations, to the farmers, to the small and medium enterprises that can't get credit and are failing, at least they are in many parts of Europe, to all kinds of social movements, trade unions, etc., and simply say to them, let's work together. How can we do it? Dankeschön.
Bevor wir nun in eine 15-minütige Pause gehen, möchte ich hinweisen auf die Stände der Trägerorganisationen dieser Friedenskonferenz. Es sind dies die Deutsche Friedensgesellschaft, Vereinigte Kriegsdienstgegnerinnen, Pax Christi, Internationaler Versöhnungsbund, Naturwissenschaftlerinneninitiative, das Netzwerk Friedenssteuer, die Projektgruppe Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz Verändern, der Kreis Jugendring und das Netzwerk Gewaltfreie Kommunikation. Lassen Sie sich draußen an den Ständen inspirieren von den Materialien. Am Ausgang, an den Seiteneingängen, stehen nun Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeiter der Konferenz mit Zettel in den Händen. Sie können Ihre Fragen auf diese Zettel schreiben und wenn Sie wieder hineinkommen in den Saal, geben Sie die Karten mit Ihren Fragen bei diesen gleichen Mitarbeiterinnen wieder ab. Zum Ende der Pause wird die Klingel im Foyer ertönen und ich darf Sie dann bitten, wieder hierher in den Saal zu kommen zum zweiten Teil des Abends. Gute Pause nun erstmal.